Assalamu alaikum. So today I want to talk about this beautiful verse in Surah Ar-Rahmaan. I want to talk about verse 7. Surah Ar-Rahmaan is chapter 55. So this beautiful verse says, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ al-meezaan. And the sama', which is often translated as heaven, he elevated it, رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ al-meezaan. And he placed the mizan, or he placed down the mizan, the scale, or the means of measuring and the means of weighing. So what I want to talk about is a few different things. So number one, when we read these verses in Surah Ar-Rahmaan, they're pointing us to things in the physical environment, things in the universe, right? So if you go back to the beginning, this is verse 7. But if you go back to verse 1, Ar-Rahmaan allama al-Qur'an. Ar-Rahmaan taught the Quran. Khalaq al-insan, created the human. He created the human being. Allamahu al-bayan, he taught him al-bayan, the ability to communicate and express himself. Ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bi-husban, the sun and the moon is according to exact calculations. Wan-najmu wash-shajaru yasjudan, and the stars and the shajar, which in another video I explained that I believe here we can interpret this as meaning the galaxies. If you want to know why, inshallah, go check the other video out. Yasjudan, they both make sujud. And I explained in some videos about Adam and the concept of sujud with Adam, as far as from the malaika, which they translate as the angels, making sujud to Adam, some ideas about what sujud is. And then we come to verse 7, he says, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا, and the sama', he elevated it. So the first thing I want to point out is when we read where we're being directed to these physical things in the universe, we don't want to just limit our thinking to the physical thing and think that's all that's talking about. So when it's talking about the sun and the moon and the stars and the shajar and the as-sama', and later it's going to talk about al-ard, like the earth, it's just talking about physical things. We don't want to think like that. Why? Because Allah tells us He will show us His ayat, His signs and lessons in all of the things around us and even within ourselves until we know that it's the truth. So He says, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. We will show them our ayat in all of the horizons around them and in themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. So what's the point of showing us all the ayat and all the lessons around us and in ourselves? So that it becomes clear that it, meaning the Quran, is the truth. So when He points us to the ayat around us, to the signs around us, to the physical things around us, to the physical things in the universe, it's not just for us to look at the physical thing as just a physical object, but it's to learn something from that. So same thing when we read the Quran, especially in a surah like this, that starts off, the first two verses are with these elevated concepts. Ar-Rahmaan allama al-Qur'an. Look at these high elevated concepts that this surah starts with. Ar-Rahmaan, we know, is one of the powerful names of Allah. In fact, Allah equates it to His name of Allah Himself. قُلِ ادْعُوا اللَّهَ أَوِ ادْعُوا الرَّحْمَانَ. Say, call upon Allah or call upon Ar-Rahman. Call upon either, right? So we know Ar-Rahman is a very, 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 very powerful name of Allah in the Quran. So He starts off this surah with this beautiful, powerful name, Ar-Rahman. And then the first thing He talks about after that is Allama al-Qur'an, that He taught the Quran. So He starts this surah off with these elevated, powerful concepts. And then as we get to verse 5, He starts drawing our attention to the physical things in our environment. So because the surah starts off primarily talking about Ar-Rahman and the Quran, I would say as we read these physical things, we want to pay close attention to what lessons can we learn from these physical things and relate it back to the Quran, because this surah starts off with the Quran. And that's even in general, we want to do that, but especially here when it talks about the Quran. So He says, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا. What does that mean? That He elevated or raised as-sama'. So let's start with the word as-sama'. As-sama' is a really interesting word in the Quran, and I honestly think that it deserves to be studied in a lot more detail. There's a lot of aspects of it, and maybe at a certain point we'll have a whole video just about that concept. But just briefly, as-sama in the Arabic language means al-ulu. It means elevation. So anything that is elevated can be called as-sama. For example, one Arabic scholar said, sama'u kulli shay' a'lahu. He said, the sama' of everything is a'lahu, its uppermost or its highest part, is its sama'. The sama' of everything is its uppermost part. So as-sama' in Arabic, first of all, means elevation. And one interesting place to think about this is in Surah Ibrahim, where Allah gives the example of kalima tayyiba, a pure word or a pure concept. A kalima could be a concept. And he relates that or compares that to, as an analogy or a metaphor, shajara tayyiba, a pure tree. Now look how he describes it. He says, Alam tara kayfa daraba Allahu mathalan. Have you not looked at or seen how Allah sets forth a parable? Kalimatan tayyibatan ka shajaratin tayyibatin. A good or pure kalima or word, ka shajaratin tayyiba, is like a good or a pure tree. And then look how he further describes it now. What is the shajara tayyiba like? What is the good and pure tree like? Asluha thabitun wa far'uha fis sama'. He said, its root is firmly established, wa far'uha fis sama', and its branches are, usually they might translate it as something like its branches reach to the heavens. But I think that's because we go to the Quran sometimes with preconceived notions of what certain words mean. So we assume as-sama' means heavens in all cases. But if we just take the linguistic Arabic meaning of it, that it's al-ulu, it means elevation, or sama'u kulli shay a'lahu, the sama' of everything is its uppermost part or its highest part, then it makes a lot of sense. The parable of the kalima tayyiba, the good or the pure word, is like the shajara tayyiba. It's like the good or the pure tree who is firmly rooted, wa far'uha fis sama', and its branches are fis sama', fil ulu. Its branches tend towards elevation. It goes towards elevation. It's something that elevates upwards. It's going upwards. And that's an analogy or a comparison to a kalima tayyiba, a good or a pure concept or word. So a good or a pure concept or word, apply that same description to it, means it has a firm root. It's firmly rooted. It's a word. It's something you say, or it's a concept that you hold, that you express, that is firmly rooted. وَفَرْعُهَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. And it's something that elevates. It's something that takes you up. It doesn't take you down. And you can see a similar idea without the use of the word sama', but we're going to connect this back to Surah Ar-Rahmaan in verse 7. You can see this similar idea of elevation connected to concepts. Like, for example, when the one who Allah gave his ayats, he says, وَاتْلُ عَلَيْهِمْ نَبَأَ الَّذِي آتَيْنَاهُ آيَاتِنَا فَانْسَلَخَ مِنْهَا. And recite upon them the news of the one that we gave our ayats, and he stripped himself from them. فَأَتْبَعَهُ الشَّيْطَانُ فَكَانَ مِنَ الْغَاوِينَ. So a shaitan followed him up, and he became of those astray. وَلَوْ شِئْنَا. And if we had willed, لَرَفَعْنَاهُ بِهَا. We would have elevated him by them. وَلَكِنَّهُ أَخْلَدَ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ. But however, he clung to the earth. So you see how the elevation by the ayat is made here the opposite of clinging to the earth. So when you go back to verse 7, Surah Ar-Rahmaan, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا. The sama', yes, we can translate as the heavens, he elevated it, he raised it. But also if we take it in a wider sense, and we take it just as symbolic of something deeper that's being talked about in this surah, which is the Quran, which is what the surah starts with, we can think of it as the concept of elevation, which is opposite to clinging to or being stuck to the earth. وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا. So the elevation that is found in connecting ourselves to the Quran, to the teachings of the Quran, is something that will elevate us and will raise us. As he said in another verse, يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتٍ. He elevates, or Allah will elevate, those who have believed from amongst you and those who have been given knowledge in levels. So to deepen this idea and to give us more indications from comparing it to other places in the Quran, let's study this term a little bit more, because another question we want to answer in studying this verse is, why did he pair it with the idea of meezaan, or scale, or something that you weigh with? Why did he pair that with that? So think about, the verse says, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ. Like rafa'a and wada'a in Arabic are opposites. Rafa'a, raised; wada'a, lowered or put down. So why did he say he elevated the sama'? So a sama' in and of itself means elevation. So perhaps rafa'a is the process of raising something that is an elevated thing, something that has the potential to be elevated. Rafa'a is the process of raising that, perhaps. But why did he make those like opposite or related in the verse? وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ. And he placed the mizan down, right? The scale or the tool for weighing. So that's another thing we want to think about that I think is going to help us explain even more. What is the meaning of raising as-sama'? Okay, so what we want to do is we want to compare this to other places in the Quran that might have a similar language and see if we can, by putting it together, this is one of the beauties and strengths of the study of the Quran, is the Quran is mutashabih, meaning its parts resemble each other. Resemble, meaning it doesn't necessarily say the same thing, but it says similar things, where when we compare them together, one place explains the other. And in actuality, that's a beautiful tool within the Quran itself. If it were not for the tashabuh that exists between the wording of certain verses, then we wouldn't be able to as easily use the Quran as a tool to explain itself. But because in one place it might phrase it in a certain way, in another place it might phrase it in a similar way, but not exactly the same, or it might give more details, then that makes the Quran this coherent, interconnected whole that can explain itself. The Quran contains its own dictionary. So the first thing we want to ask is, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا. The sama', he elevated it. So is there somewhere else in the Quran that he talks about elevating as-sama' or even as-samawat? And yes, there is. So let's go to 13:2. So if we go to chapter 13, and we're going to go to verse 2. And 13:2 says, Allahu alladhi rafa'a as-samawati bighayri amadin tarawnaha. Allah rafa'a, elevated or raised as-samawat, the heavens, if you want to translate it that, but it comes from the word sama', right? As-samawat bighayri amadin tarawnaha, without any supports that you see. Okay, so why did he say without any supports that you see? So Allah knows best, but I think the reason he tells us without any supports that you see is it's telling us there are supports. So when he raised as-samawat, he didn't raise it without supports. It's without supports that you see. So what supports exist that we don't see? Well, the fundamental laws of nature. There's 4 fundamental forces that we talk about in physics. There's the law of gravity. There's laws of nature that uphold the entire universe that we live in. Perhaps these are the supports that we don't see. We don't directly see them on a daily basis, but we know they're there from other reasons, from mathematical tools and other discoveries that we can discover they're there. So thinking about it like that, see, this adds a little bit of a dimension to the idea of the elevation or the raising of as-sama' or as-samawat. Because if that's the case, if saying without supports that you can see indicates that he raises it with supports, but just that you can't see, which are laws and principles that govern everything, and I think the rest of the verse we're going to read will support this idea, then that's actually a very deep idea, because then what that might be telling us, or at least part of it, is that when we say in Surah Ar-Rahmaan, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا, And the sama, he rafa'aha, he elevated it, means he elevated it by laws and principles. So the true elevation of something that by its nature has the potential to be an elevated thing, which is a sama, is to elevate it by giving it laws and principles. And that's the true elevation of any of us. And that goes back to some of the verses that we just read, right? يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتٍ. Allah elevates those amongst you who have believed and those who have been given knowledge. وَلَوْ شِئْنَا لَرَفَعْنَاهُ بِهَا. Had we willed, we would have elevated him by them, by our ayat. So it's by laws and principles that we become elevated, by living as a principled person. And perhaps that's how the universe is elevated. It's not just a chaotic mess. It functions according to laws and principles. By Ahmed, it has supports that you don't see. Another way that we can see this meaning, that perhaps this is part of the meaning that we're studying here, is if we flip to another surah, which is 41, and then we'll go to verse 11 and 12. Look at how beautiful this fits together. So the verse we started with in Surah Ar-Rahmaan, he tells us, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا. And as-sama, he elevated it or raised it. And then in another verse, which is in Surah 13, verse 2, he mentions the idea of رَفَعَ السَّمَاوَاتِ بِغَيْرِ عَمَدٍ تَرَوْنَهَا. He raised and elevated as-samawat without supports that you can see. So perhaps indicating he raised it using supports that you can't see, laws and principles, and that's the elevation. And to support that, if we go to 41, 11, and 12, he says, ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى إِلَى السَّمَاءِ وَهِيَ دُخَانٌ. Then he turned his attention to as-sama' while it was dukhan. It was like gas. Sometimes they translate it as smoke. فَقَالَ لَهَا وَلِلْأَرْضِ ائْتِيَا طَوْعًا أَوْ كَرْهًا. So he said to it and to the earth, come willingly or unwillingly. قَالَتَا أَتَيْنَا طَائِعِينَ. They both said, we come willingly. Now look at the next verse. فَقَضَاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ. So he قَضَاهُنَّ, he completed them into sab'a samawat, to 7 samawat. So notice in verse 11, we start off with the idea of as-sama', which we started off with in Surah Ar-Rahmaan. Look at the progression. In Surah Ar-Rahmaan, it says, was-sama'a rafa'aha. As-sama', we elevated it, we raised it. And then, or he raised it. And then we went to the next surah, which was 13:2, and he said, rafa'a as-samawat. He elevated as-samawat, right? So there's a relationship between as-sama' and as-samawat. And here we see the relationship very clearly. That verse 11 starts off with as-sama' as like an undifferentiated whole. And then in the next verse he says, فَقَضَاهُنْ. He completed them, sab'a samawat, into 7 samawat. And then he says, fi yawmaini, in 2 days, وَأَوْحَى فِي كُلِّ سَمَاءٍ أَمْرَهَا. وَأَوْحَى فِي كُلِّ سَمَاءٍ أَمْرَهَا. And he inspired in every sama' amraha, its system of regulations, its system of programs. He programmed every sama'. So when you put the verses together, I think that lends support to the idea, because he says, وَأَوْحَى فِي كُلِّ سَمَاءٍ أَمْرَهَا, that he inspired in every sama' its command. That when we go to 13:2, when he says he elevated as-samawat without supports that you can see, means similar to what this verse says, وَأَوْحَى فِي كُلِّ سَمَاءٍ أَمْرَهَا, that he inspired in every sama' its system of commands, so its laws and principles that it functions according to. That's the elevation and the raising of it. So in Surah Ar-Rahmaan, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا, as-sama', he elevated it, perhaps, is drawing our attention to a very, very important thing, that the universe is elevated by laws and principles. And therefore, if we want to be elevated, then we have to function according to laws and principles. And that's by going back to the Quran, which is in the second verse. Now, what I want to cover next is what is al-meezaan? Why is al-meezaan? Why is the scale or the tool for weighing? Why is that in the same verse? Why? What was sama'a rafa'aha wa wada al-meezaan? The sama, he raised it, he elevated it, and he placed the meezan, the tool for weighing. Why? So to figure that out, I want to connect to another verse. So here's how we're going to connect these two places together. So in 13:2, he talks about elevating as-samawat without any supports that you can see. So what I asked myself when I was studying this is, where else in the Quran does it talk about, or does it use this phrase, supports, without supports that you can see? And perhaps by comparing those together, we can get some more details. So I found another place, which is 31:10, Surah Luqman. So in 31:10, he uses that phrase again, but this time he uses it with the word khalaqa. See the connection? One verse says rafa'a, he elevated it, and here this verse says khalaqa, he created it. Khalaqa as-samawati bighayri amadin tarawnaha. He created as-samawat without any supports that you can see. So that lends support to this interpretation, because khalaqa and rafa'a were made interchangeable. Not that they mean the same thing. They don't exactly mean the same thing. And when we interpret the Quran, I'm not saying that we make the words mean the same thing, but because they're using the same context, they have a relationship. So rafa'a, the elevation, perhaps was a part of the process of the creation of as-samawat without pillars or without supports that you can see, which perhaps ties back to the other verse, wa awha fi kulli sama'in amraha, where he inspired in every sama its system of commands. So these all kind of interrelate. They're not the same, but they interrelate. خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ بِغَيْرِ عَمَدٍ تَرَوْنَهَا. He created as-samawat without any supports that you can see. Now, there's more to this verse. He's going to talk about the earth and some other things. But just for the sake of time, I want to connect this now with meezan, with the idea of a tool for weighing, right? A scale. And what that means in the verse from Surah Ar-Rahmaan, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ. So this is verse 10 in chapter 31. 31:10, he says, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ بِغَيْرِ عَمَدٍ تَرَوْنَهَا. He created as-samawat without any supports that you can see. So that's verse 10. Then verse 11 starts off, هَذَا خَلْقُ اللَّهِ. This is the creation of Allah. And there's a little more to it. But then when you go to verse 12, he says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةَ. And truly we gave Luqman al-hikmah. We gave Luqman the wisdom. So subhanallah, right after he talks about, he uses that phrase from the very first verse. So follow the train of reasoning. In the very first verse that we talked about, Surah Ar-Rahmaan, he elevated as-sama' and he placed the meezan, the tool for weighing. And then when we go to another place, he talks about elevating as-samawat without any supports. And then when we come here, he created as-samawat without any supports that you can see. And then right after that, here a couple verses later, he talks about giving Luqman al-hikmah, wisdom. So is it a coincidence, or what's the relationship between mentioning this context in Surah Luqman, that he created as-samawat without any supports that you can see, and like right after a couple verses later, he talks about giving Luqman al-hikmah, wisdom. So I think perhaps when you put that together, that is something that indicates or leads us to thinking, and Allah knows best, that al-meezan, in the original verse in Surah Ar-Rahmaan, that al-meezan is al-hikmah, or related to al-hikmah, to wisdom. So al-meezan, the tool for weighing, is related to the concept of hikmah. And so the connection is وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ. The sama, we elevated it. So this is talking about the principles the principles and the laws that the universe is based upon. He elevated that. He established that. He established these principles. However, he also placed al-meezaan, a tool for weighing, because when we only have principles, when we only have laws, then we become tyrants. We also need meezaan. We also need to be able to weigh these laws and principles in accordance with the human beings that we meet. We can't just take the laws and principles and apply them blindly to every human being. That's when we become unjust, because maybe a person has something going on that we don't know about, and if we don't take the time to get to know them, we just come to them. As I say sometimes, we come to them on the level of information, of pure information, and we forget the human aspect, and that's when we end up hurting people or end up pushing people away from Islam, end up wronging people, because we're missing the mizan, we're missing the tool for weighing things out. So, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا, the elevation of as-sama according to laws and principles, and the mizan is how we live and apply those laws and principles. It's the hikmah, it's the wisdom to be able to apply those laws and principles in our life. It's the weighing, because the word mizan itself, if you think about it, it means to weigh the heaviness or the lightness of something. Because if you look in the Quran, you look at the plural, for example, mawazin, he talks about, for example, فَمَنْ ثَقُلَتْ مَوَازِينُهُ, whoever his scales, his mawazin is heavy, or وَمَنْ خَفَّتْ مَوَازِينُهُ, whoever his scales is light. So the mizan is a tool for weighing the heaviness and the lightness of something. So in every situation, we can't just go blindly with laws and principles. We have to weigh out the heaviness or the lightness, the importance or the lack of importance of certain things in certain situations. That's how we become wise. And Allah didn't tell us to invite to his path by the principles. He taught us to invite to his path by al-hikmah, by the wise usage of these principles. He said, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'izati al hasanati wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan." He said, call to the way of your Lord with hikmah, with wisdom, with a beautiful preaching, and debate with them in a way that's more beautiful. So the calling even to the way of your Lord is with hikmah. It's with wisdom. It's with a mizan. It's with the ability to weigh things out. That's how you become a wise person. So for example, a really simple day-to-day example that we all experience are things in traffic, for example. We talk about road rage, right? This person cuts you off in traffic, or they do something that you don't like, and then you want to flip them off or you want to cuss them out. What if that person has a gun? What if that person wants to jump out and try to kill you because you flip them off? Or what if they want to follow you? So the hakim, the wise person, has a mizan. He doesn't just have the laws and the principles, because you might say, no, he's wrong. He shouldn't have did that to me. He's absolutely wrong. He might be absolutely wrong. Absolutely. He might be absolutely wrong. Absolutely. Right? He might have violated something. He might have transgressed. But is it possible that you're going to make the situation worse because you're not using the mizan? You're not using the scales to weigh out what's most important. What is that really going to accomplish? And it could end up hurting you. Is that worth your life, or is that worth just the headache, or is that worth your peace? Right? So the mizan is something that helps us weigh out and be wise and weigh out the relative importance or lack of importance in things in our lives. And to show another proof that the mizan is hikmah, perhaps, and we always say that because at the end of the day, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, none knows its final implementation except for Allah. So we don't claim to know the final implementation, but we're just reflecting. But another indication to me that al-mizan could be al-hikmah, the wisdom, is we're going to compare a couple verses. If you go to chapter 2, verse 151, so chapter 2, verse 151, he says, كَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا فِيكُمْ رَسُولًا مِنْكُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْكُمْ آيَاتِنَا, just as we have sent amongst you a messenger from amongst you, يَتْلُو عَلَيْكُمْ آيَاتِنَا, reciting upon you our ayat, our signs and lessons, وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ, and purifying you, وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, and teaching you the book and the wisdom. The book and the wisdom. So the book, let's start with the book. The book is the system of laws. the system of principles. Why? Because when you look at certain verses in the Quran, for example, you see it used, or variations of the word used like that. So for example, you see kutiba alaykum siyam. Fasting was, they usually translate it as fasting was prescribed upon you. But the way they phrase it is a variation of the word kitab from the root word kataba, kutiba, like it was written upon you. Kutiba alaykum al-qisasu fil qatla. Al-qisas is prescribed or written upon you concerning al-qatla, the slain people, right? So you see this usage of kitab or kutiba as laws and principles that are set forth. So al-kitab, Allah knows best, perhaps are the laws and the principles. But we don't just have the laws and the principles, we also have al-hikmah. يُعَلِّمُكُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ, teaching them al-kitab and al-hikmah. So we have the wisdom to know how to apply those laws and principles in life. And so you might say, well, where are you getting the idea that al-hikmah here is connected to al-meezaan? So if you go to chapter 57, and you go to verse 25. So remember in the verse that we just read, which is 2:151, he references a messenger from amongst you. And what does that messenger teach? Al-kitab wal-hikmah, the book and the wisdom. Now, if you go to chapter 57, verse 25, look what he says. لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ. We have truly sent our messengers with clear evidences. So same thing, he's referencing messengers, but here in the plural. In the other place, he said, we sent to you a messenger from amongst yourselves, teaching you the book and the wisdom. But here he's talking about messengers in general, which includes the messenger sent to you. لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ. Truly, we have sent our messengers with bayinat, with clear evidences. وَأَنزَلْنَا, and we sent down with them, مَعَهُمْ, وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانِ. And we sent down with them the book and the mizan, and the scale, the weighing, the tool of weighing. لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, so that people can fulfill al-qist. Al-qist is often translated as justice, but al-qist in Arabic means nasib, it means a portion. So the mizan, the scale, helps you to give everything its due portion. لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, so that people can live their life by giving everything its due portion. That includes people, that includes yourself, to give everything its due portion. That's qist, inshallah. So al-kitab and al-mizan, al-kitab and al-hikmah, go back to Surah Ar-Rahmaan was-samaa'a rafa'aha wa wada'a al-meezaan. We're elevated, we're raised by principles and laws. This is a state of elevation. Wa wada'a al-meezaan, but he also placed down the mizan, the scale, the tool for weighing, to let us know how to take those principles and how to live according to them. And Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.